hope you all are doing really well and are in best of your health, both physical and mental. This is Ritika and we are doing corporate issuers. And we are starting with the very first chapter of this book, which is organizational forms, corporate issuer features and ownership. So we'll basically be discussing the structures in which the organizations are created and organized, the features of each such structure, and how is the ownership of each such structure held. This chapter has 3 learning outcomes. Let's begin with the first one, which requires us to compare the organizational forms of a business. So let's get started. Before we begin, let me ask a question. What is a business organization? We all know what a business organization is. Business organizations are entities involved in commercial activities conducting the owner's regular occupation, profession, or trade. So I have a question for all of you. Some of you must be having your own business. Some must be working in some other business organization. So tell me in the comments, what business organization do you work with? I'm looking forward to reading what CFA students are doing these days. So anyways, there are 3 types of business organizations based on their structures. For-profit organizations, also known as businesses or companies or corporations. These include both private and public companies. Then we have not-for-profit, non-governmental organizations. These are mostly charitable organizations and government or government organizations, meaning those organizations which are funded by the government. Now moving on to the next question. What are the factors that determine business structures? So there are different attributes that define a business structure, like legal identity. Different business structures have different legal identities. Most businesses have a legal identity separate from their owner. Say for example, a company which in the eye of law is not same as its owners. It is a separate entity altogether with its own rights and responsibilities. And there are other entities that have same identity as their owners, like sole proprietorship, where the owner is accountable for the business debt and other activities. Next, we have different owner-manager relationships with different business types. Sometimes the owners of the businesses manage the business, like in the case of sole proprietorship. And sometimes the managers are the employees of the business, like in the case of companies, where the managers and executives are appointed by the board of directors, which in turn is appointed by the shareholders. The third is owner's liability. There are different legal liabilities for the owner of the business depending on the structure of the businesses. For example, in businesses with unlimited liabilities, the owner is liable for the action and debt taken by the business, whereas in the businesses with limited liabilities, the owner's responsibility is limited to the capital contribution. So if you purchase the shares of a company, you become its owner. But you wouldn't be responsible for the debt default, if any, made by the company. Your risk of loss is limited up to the amount of your investment unless you provide a personal guarantee for the loan taken by the company. The fourth attribute is the tax structure. This attribute defines the applicable taxation on the profits and losses of the business. In some entities, the profits and losses are taxed at the hands of the entity. Like in the case of companies, the profits and losses are taxed at the company level itself. Whereas, in the case of sole proprietorship and partnership firms, the taxes are passed on to the hands of the owners and not taxed at the hands of the firm. And the last attribute is the access to financing. Some business structures such as partnerships and corporations can raise higher amount of finance in comparison with sole proprietorship businesses. This is because the companies offer share to a very large amount and anyone with a little amount of investment to be made can also invest in a company. So there are a large number of investors with the companies in comparison with the partnerships and proprietary businesses. So next we'll discuss what are different types of capital structures. Based on the attributes that we just discussed, we have the following types of capital structures. The first is for profit businesses, which include sole proprietorship, partnership, and limited companies. Then, partnership can be classified into general partnership and limited partnerships. Then, we have not for profit businesses. And lastly, governments. We'll discuss them in detail one by one. Let's start with the sole proprietorship or sole traders. In a sole proprietorship business, the owners invest all the capital, manage the operations, and have full ownership of the risk and returns of the business. As we see around ourselves, small businessmen like store owners, they put all their money to rent the store, purchase the inventory, and fund all the operations. They also manage the stores themselves and receive full profits and losses from its operations. Some other examples of sole proprietorship businesses are freelance writers, yoga trainers, tutors, plumbers, etc. A good number of small businesses are structured as sole proprietorships only. So, what are the main features of a sole proprietorship business? As I mentioned before, the capital is provided by the proprietor and they control the operations of the business. Second, the owners fully participate in the risk and returns of the business. Whether it is profit or loss, it completely belongs to them. Then, the business does not have a separate legal identity apart from the owner. The firm might have a separate brand name, but in the eyes of the law, especially for taxation purpose, the business is not separate from its owner. Further, there is no legal requirement to dissolve the business. The business dissolves when the business activity ceases or when the owner dies. And this is mainly because the business is not separate from its owner. And the business profits, they are taxed as the personal income of the owner. It is a pass-through tax system. Then, this type of structure is simple and flexible. You just decide and start the business. There is no need for any legal formalities related to registration and other compliances which are applicable to the corporations. And the most important feature, the owner is personally liable for the debt and other activities of the business. So if a sole proprietor has taken debt from you for his business, you can demand your money back even if his business goes bankrupt. He has to pay the debt back from his personal assets. Now moving on to the partnerships. In partnership, the firms can generate a higher amount of capital, which is often brought by the additional partners. So in a proprietorship, there was only one owner and his capital. Now there is more than one owner and they bring in additional capital. They also share the risk and returns of the business. Now there are two types of partnerships, general partnership and limited partnership. What are general partnerships? General partnership is an extension of sole proprietorship in a sense that additional partners bring in additional capital. They also share the risk and return along with the control of the business. So what are the main features of a general partnership? Well, pretty much the same as proprietorship except that there is more than one owner of the business. These owners bring in additional capital for the business operations. Along with the additional capital, the partners also bring in their share of expertise. The partners share control over the business operations together. The risks and the returns are shared amongst the partners in agreed ratio and on agreed terms. In general partnerships, the liability or the debt and the actions of the firm are unlimited and shared amongst the partners in agreed ratio. So like a proprietorship, even if the business goes bankrupt, the partners are liable to pay for the debt from their personal assets. If one partner is unable to pay his share of debt, then the remaining partners are liable to pay for the same. The business is also not a separate legal identity apart from the identity of its owners. And since the business and its partners are not considered as separate identities, the taxes are passed through to the owners. And the profits and losses are taxed as personal incomes of the owners. Now, moving on, what is a limited partnership and how is it different from the general partnership? A limited partnership is a partnership agreement just like general partnership but with a minor difference. In a limited partnership, there are two types of partners. There is one general partner with unlimited liabilities who is liable to pay for the debt from his personal assets if the business assets are depleted. And the remaining partners are generally limited partners who have limited liabilities. The liability of these partners is limited to the amount of investment they've made in the business or the amount as agreed in the terms of partnership. The potential losses of the limited partners are limited up to the size of their investment. Therefore, the personal assets of the limited partners are protected against the obligations of the business. They won't have to pay anything extra from their personal assets in case of business bankruptcy. What are the main features of a limited partnership? Businesses in such a partnership is often managed by general partner only. The limited partners often bring their expertise, but their responsibility is limited as agreed in the partnership agreement, which is generally up to the value of capital they have invested or any amount as guaranteed in the case of a contingency. Here, the personal assets of limited partners are considered separate from the business. Therefore, they are not tied to the debt or any other obligations of the business. The partnership agreement under such a partnership is often complex. They are customized according to different profit and loss sharing agreements. It basically specifies the liability of each partner in case of contingency. Like for general partners, it is unlimited. But for the limited partners, it specifies the amount, if any, that can be recovered from their personal assets, which in general is often zero. So in general, it specifies the course of action that can be taken for recovery in case of any contingency or bankruptcy. Another important feature of a limited partnership business is that these are also pass-through businesses for taxation purposes, meaning that the share of profits or losses of limited partners are taxed as their personal income and not as the income of the firm. That is, the businesses are not taxed separately. Their profits are transferred to the business owners and taxed as their personal income. Sometimes, under limited liability partnerships, there are no general partners also. Here, the risk of all the partners is limited up to their capital contribution, and such a type of partnership firm structure is generally permitted only for professional service firms like accounting firms, law firms, etc. And most of these firms are incorporated as limited liability partnerships only. Now moving on to the corporations or limited liability companies. Limited liability companies or simply corporations are like limited liability partnerships, but they have way more features than these partnerships. And on a flip side, they also have way more compliance and regulatory requirements. So this structure is a little more costly. The ownership of capital here is divided into smaller units called shares. The shares have improved transferability features. So if you have a small amount to invest, you can even buy a single unit of a share of a company and can sell the same on exchange in case of liquidity needs. And the owners of these shares are called shareholders. The shareholders are the owners of the company and they can transfer their ownership through sale of their shares. What are the main features of corporation or limited liability companies? Limited liability companies have a separate legal identity which is different from the identity of their owners or shareholders. Owners are generally not responsible for the debt and other affairs of the company except for when the corporate veil is lifted, but that's in the extreme cases of fraud, etc. The shareholders often appoint the board of directors who manage the affairs of the company through annual and general meetings. They generally vote for the appointment of the board in AGMs and EGMs. Corporations are not pass-through entities for taxation purposes. The profits and losses of the corporations are first taxed and then the remaining profits are passed on to the owners, generally in form of dividends. though the company also has to pay dividend distribution tax at the time of distribution of dividends. And then these dividends sometimes are taxed in the hands of shareholders. This leads to taxes being paid multiple times. Corporations generally have a higher access to capital and expertise. This is mainly because it can issue so many units of shares to millions of shareholders. Therefore, they can raise such a high amount of capital that partners in a firm cannot raise for their firm. And larger capital enables them to employ a better and greater number of experts for their tasks. Therefore, for projects involving higher capital, corporations are the preferred form of business structure. Now moving on to not-for-profit businesses. These are the businesses that are mainly involved in charitable and social causes. Their profits are not distributed, rather they are plowed back into the business to be used for these purposes only. And as long as the business profits are not distributed, these corporations are not taxed either. Some examples of famous not-for-profit corporations are Red Cross Society, American Heart Association, United Way, CARE, etc. Then we have government or government-based corporations. These are the corporations in which government either has substantial holding or is floated by government itself. We will now discuss what different types of corporations are in detail. There are mainly three types of corporations: non-profit corporations, public for-profit corporations, and private for-profit corporations. Let us discuss non-profit corporations first. Non-profit corporations are often established for charitable purposes such as providing public health, religious purposes, promoting education, etc. The structure of non-profit corporations is similar to that of for-profit corporations. The owners are called shareholders and appoint the board of directors for management purposes. These corporations are allowed to earn profits, but these corporations do not distribute the profits as dividends to their shareholders. They plow back the profits and use the same for the purposes of the corporation. That is, to promote the education, religion, or healthcare, etc. These corporations also do not generally pay taxes. That's because in most countries, if these corporations are using profits for social purposes, the profits become exempt from taxation. Then we have public for-profit corporations. These corporations are incorporated to earn profits for their owners or shareholders. These are profit-driven companies. Like most corporations listed on stock exchanges are profit-driven. They may be undertaking social causes as a part of their CSR activities, but the main objective still is to earn profit for their shareholders. The shares of these corporations are usually listed on stock exchanges and they are often publicly traded. For public corporations, there are no limit to the number of owners or transferability of shares. Anyone can buy or sell the shares as and when they want on any stock exchange. Therefore, these corporations have greater access to capital and unlimited growth potential. And lastly, we have private for-profit corporations. Unlike public corporations, under most jurisdictions, private corporations have a limit to the number of shareholders. For example, the Security Exchange Act of US limits the privately held company to having less than 2,000 shareholders. And the US Investment Company Act requires the registration of investment companies that have more than 100 shareholders. Therefore, the amount of capital that these companies can raise is also limited in comparison with public corporations with unlimited number of shareholders. The shares of private companies are generally not traded on stock exchanges. They are generally traded through buyer-seller agreement. The seller must find a buyer, and if the company approves the transfer, they can sell the share as per the terms of agreement. The profits of these companies are also transferred to the owners through dividends. These companies are also managed by the board of directors appointed by the shareholders of the company. Sometimes in privately held companies, the board of directors is comprised of its major shareholders. So this was all in the first learning outcome of this reading. We'll start with the next learning outcome in the next video. Till then, study well and practice even more. Take care.